When someone who caused you deep emotional harm suddenly avoids you, disappears, or acts as if you no longer exist, it's easy to internalize that silence as rejection or dismissal. But the truth is far more revealing and far more empowering. This avoidance is not about indifference. It's not about you being forgettable. It's about discomfort. It's about the unbearable weight of self-awareness they are desperate to outrun. Narcissistic patterns thrive on control, image, and denial. And the moment you begin to see clearly, heal openly, or stand firmly in your truth, you become the one thing they cannot manage. A living reminder of the damage they caused and the power they lost. They avoid those they've hurt because those people represent accountability. Your presence challenges the story they tell themselves, that they were justified, superior, untouchable. Your growth threatens the fragile narrative that keeps their identity intact. And so they retreat, not because they are strong, but because facing you would require humility, empathy, and responsibility, qualities they struggle to access. Today, this is not about understanding them for their sake. This is about understanding this dynamic, so you can finally stop questioning your worth and start recognizing your strength. When someone pulls away from you after causing harm, the easiest lie to believe is that you must have been insignificant, too fragile, or somehow lacking. But that interpretation misses the deeper psychological reality. They don't avoid you because you are weak. They avoid you because you see clearly now. You are no longer confused by their charm, no longer hypnotized by their shifting narratives, no longer shrinking yourself to preserve their comfort. And that clarity is deeply threatening to a personality built on distortion and control. Seeing the truth changes the power dynamic. Once you recognize patterns instead of excuses, manipulation instead of misunderstanding, entitlement instead of love, you stop playing the role assigned to you. You stop absorbing blame that was never yours. You stop feeding the illusion that they are flawless, misunderstood, or morally superior. And when that happens, your very existence becomes destabilizing. You don't even have to say anything. Your awareness speaks for you. Your boundaries speak for you. Your calm refusal to engage in chaos speaks for you. Avoidance becomes their safest strategy, because confrontation would require honesty. Looking at you would mean facing what they did, how they benefited from your empathy, and how much of their self-image was propped up by your silence. That kind of reckoning creates unbearable internal discomfort. So instead of reflecting, they retreat. Instead of repairing, they erase, not because they forgot you, but because they remember exactly who you are and what you now represent in your life. This realization is not meant to reopen wounds. It's meant to close them. Their avoidance is not evidence of your inadequacy. It is confirmation of your growth. It means you no longer participate in self-betrayal. It means your nervous system has learned safety. It means you trust your perceptions instead of gaslighting yourself to keep the peace. That is strength, even if it doesn't feel loud or dramatic. There is a quiet power in being someone who sees the truth and chooses themselves anyway. You don't chase closure from those incapable of accountability. You don't need validation from people who survive by denying reality. You allow distance to exist without interpreting it as failure. And in doing so, you reclaim your dignity. You begin to understand that being avoided is sometimes the clearest sign that you have stepped out of a role that once served someone else at your expense. Healing changes you in ways that are quiet but undeniable. It shifts how you respond, what you tolerate, and what you no longer explain away. When you begin to heal, you stop centering your life around confusion and self-doubt. You start trusting your inner signals. You begin choosing peace over chaos. And that transformation, while deeply personal, becomes profoundly confronting to someone who caused you harm. Your healing becomes a mirror they refuse to face because it reflects not who you used to be, but who they were in the story you no longer accept. For someone who relies on denial to protect their sense of self, your growth is destabilizing. Healing removes the fog that once allowed them to rewrite history, minimize impact, or shift blame. You no longer need their version of events to make sense of your pain. You no longer ask them to define reality for you, and in that clarity, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. You are grounded, reflective, and accountable. They are still defending, avoiding, and fragmenting responsibility. That difference feels like exposure even when you say nothing at all. In your life, healing does not look like revenge or triumph. It looks like emotional regulation. It looks like boundaries that don't require explanations. It looks like a nervous system learning safety after prolonged stress. And when you embody that steadiness, it quietly highlights the instability they worked so hard to hide. Your calm presence becomes a mirror, showing unresolved guilt, shame, and emptiness they have no tools to process. Instead of stepping into growth themselves, they turn away from the reflection. This avoidance is not proof that your healing is invisible. It is proof that it is powerful. You no longer chase acknowledgement from someone incapable of empathy. You no longer collapse in the face of withdrawal or silence. You recognize that accountability feels threatening to those who built the identity around being untouchable. Your healing disrupts the dynamic where they held emotional leverage. It reminds them that control was never strength and that superiority was always fragile. As you continue healing, you begin to understand something liberating. You are not responsible for making them face themselves. Your role is not to soften your growth so they can remain comfortable. Your healing is not an attack, it is a reclamation. And when they refuse to look at the mirror you now hold simply by existing, it confirms that your work has taken root where it matters most. Within you, silence after harm is often mistaken for calm, maturity, or closure. But in your life, that silence is rarely peaceful. It carries tension, avoidance, and unfinished emotional business. When someone who hurt you chooses silence instead of accountability, it isn't because everything has settled. It's because facing the truth would require a level of responsibility they are unwilling or unable to take. Silence becomes a shield, a way to escape discomfort without changing behavior. Accountability demands reflection. It asks a person to recognize impact, not just intention. It requires acknowledging that their actions caused pain, confusion, or lasting emotional harm. For someone whose sense of self depends on being right, superior, or blameless, this process feels threatening. So instead of engaging, they disappear. They withdraw conversations. They rewrite the narrative in their own mind. Silence allows them to avoid the emotional work that growth requires. In your life, this silence can be destabilizing if you don't understand what it represents. It can make you question whether your pain mattered, whether you imagined the harm, or whether speaking up was a mistake. But the absence of dialogue is not a verdict on your worth. It is evidence of their fear. Your willingness to confront reality exposes their avoidance. Your clarity highlights their resistance. And that contrast is uncomfortable for someone invested in denial. Silence is also a way to retain control. By refusing to engage, they avoid vulnerability. They avoid admitting fault. They avoid the risk of being seen clearly. And in doing so, they try to leave you carrying unanswered questions while they protect their self-image. But this dynamic only works when you believe silence equals power. When you begin to understand that silence is rooted in fear, its grip loosens. As you grow, you learn that peace does not require mutual agreement or acknowledgement from someone who harmed you. Real peace comes from self-validation, from trusting your lived experience, and from no longer chasing conversations that would only reopen wounds. You realize that accountability cannot be forced. It has to be chosen. And when someone chooses silence, they are revealing their limits, not yours. In your life, this understanding becomes grounding. You stop interpreting silence as rejection and start seeing it as information. You see that capacity for reflection, empathy, and honesty has outgrown the dynamic. You recognize that accountability would require them to change, and silence is how they avoid that crossroads. This awareness allows you to move forward without bitterness, without self-doubt, and without waiting for an apology that may never come. Control only works when fear is present. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing connection. For a long time in your life, that fear may have kept you small, careful, overly accommodating. It may have taught you to explain yourself endlessly, to tolerate emotional inconsistency, to doubt your own perceptions. But the moment you rise unafraid, something fundamental shifts. Their strategies no longer land. Their intimidation no longer disorients you. Their control begins to collapse because it no longer has a foundation. Rising unafraid does not mean becoming aggressive or dominant. It means becoming grounded. It means you stop reacting and start responding. You no longer panic when there is withdrawal or silence. You no longer scramble to repair what you didn't break. You recognize manipulation without needing to call it out. And that calm clarity is destabilizing to someone who depended on your emotional reactivity to maintain power. In your life, fearlessness looks subtle. It looks like pausing instead of defending. It looks like boundaries that don't come with long explanations. It looks like trusting your internal compass, even when someone else denies your reality. This kind of strength doesn't announce itself, but it is deeply felt. And when you embody it, the dynamic changes whether or not either of you names it. Control collapses because it requires participation. It requires you to question yourself more than you question their behavior. It requires you to stay emotionally available while they remain emotionally evasive. When you rise unafraid, you quietly withdraw that participation. You stop engaging in circular conversations. You stop hoping consistency will suddenly appear. You stop waiting for permission to feel settled in your own truth. This is when avoidance often increases. This is when narratives may shift. This is when distance grows. Not because you have failed, but because the old levers no longer work. Your self-trust disrupts the imbalance. Your emotional independence removes their leverage. Your refusal to be provoked exposes how much control depended on your fear rather than their strength. In your life, this moment is not about proving anything to them. It's about reclaiming yourself. You realize that fear was never your flaw. It was a response to instability. And now that you feel safe within yourself, that fear dissolves. What remains is discernment, confidence, and a deep sense of internal permission to live freely. When you rise unafraid, you don't need closure from someone who avoided accountability. You don't need validation from someone threatened by your growth. Their control collapses not because you fought harder, but because you stepped into a version of yourself that no longer needed to be controlled. This is where your story turns inward, not backward. The end of their influence is not marked by confrontation, apologies, or dramatic closure. It is marked by your calm, by the absence of fear, by the moment you stop orienting your life around someone else's limitations. You realize that what once felt powerful over you only worked because you were still hoping, still explaining, still trying to be understood by someone invested in misunderstanding you. Now, you no longer need to be seen by those who could not see you then. You no longer need to be heard by those who silenced you. Your growth has made those needs as obsolete. The distance, the silence, the avoidance, these are no longer wounds. They are confirmation that you stepped out a system that required your suffering to survive. You carry forward with discernment instead of bitterness, with strength instead of vigilance. You trust yourself. You protect your peace. You choose relationships where accountability is not threatening and empathy is not conditional. This is not the end of something you lost. It is the beginning of a life you reclaimed. And nothing unsettles those who relied on control more than someone who walks away whole, aware, and unafraid.